The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the bank sent its second notice, and Cal Merritt read both of them standing at the kitchen table without sitting down, which was the way he received most bad news, upright, as if staying on his feet might keep the worst of it from settling in. The bank's letter said what he already knew: 90 days. The Merritt land, 412 acres of high plains grass and cedar breaks that his grandfather had broken from raw ground 70 years ago, would pass to creditors unless the terms of the original inheritance deed were satisfied in full. Those terms were not about money, or not entirely. They were about something older and stranger than money, written by a grandfather who believed that land without a family to hold it was just dirt waiting to blow away. The deed required that the inheriting Merritt be married before his 35th birthday or transfer the property to the county land trust. Cal's 35th birthday was 11 weeks out. The second letter was from a woman named Ada Voss. He had placed the advertisement himself, which had cost him something he could not name precisely, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something about the story a man tells himself about how his life is supposed to go. The advertisement had been short and deliberately plain. He was not the kind of man who dressed things up. It said he was 34, owned a working cattle operation in the high plains, needed a wife who understood the practical nature of the arrangement, and that he was not looking for performance or pretense on either side. He had added, almost as an afterthought, that the land was worth preserving. Most of the responses had been what he expected. A few were genuinely kind but clearly wrong. Two were outright peculiar. One woman sent a photograph of herself standing in front of a motor car in a city dress and asked if he had indoor plumbing, which told him most of what he needed to know. Ada Voss sent no photograph. She sent 3 paragraphs in a careful, even hand on plain paper, and the 3 paragraphs told him more about a person than most people manage to convey in an hour of conversation. She said she was 29, had grown up on a ranch in the hill country before it was sold off after her father's death, understood cattle work and the particular silence of open land, and was not afraid of hard winters or harder years. She said she was not interested in a man who wanted a decoration, and that she would appreciate plain dealing above all else. Then she said something that stopped him. She wrote, "I have my own reasons for needing a quiet place to begin again. I will not explain them yet, but I will not lie about them either. If that troubles you, I understand." He read that last part 4 times. He wrote back the same evening, "If you are still interested, the style profile JSON says to stay." And so do I. He had not meant to write that last line. He crossed it out, then left it. She arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, stepping down from the stage with a leather traveling case in one hand and a small wooden box held against her ribs with the other arm in a way that suggested the box mattered more than everything else she owned. She was not what he had pictured, though he could not have said clearly what he had pictured. She was composed in the way that people are composed when they have practiced it against something. Dark-haired, not quite tall, with the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from self-possession. She looked at the town first before she looked for him, which he noticed. She was reading the place before she committed to it. He stepped forward. He did not extend his hand immediately because he was not sure of the protocol and he did not like doing things wrong. She looked at him with a directness that was slightly startling. Most people meeting a stranger looked a little sideways at first. She did not. "Mr. Merritt, Miss Voss." A pause of about 4 seconds, which was long enough to mean something. "How far is the ranch?" she asked. 40 minutes by wagon, hour and a half if the creek is up." "Is the creek up?" "Not today." "Good," she said, and picked up her traveling case. He reached for it. She allowed him to take it, but she kept the wooden box herself, which he understood was not rudeness but instruction. He did not ask about the box. They rode the first 20 minutes in silence that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was being tested by both of them, the way you test ice before you walk out on it. The land spread wide on either side of the road, brown grass bending under a northwest wind. The sky the particular gray of early November that carries the memory of last winter and the promise of the next one. He watched her from the side of his eye and saw her watching the land with an expression he recognized. Not admiration exactly, which was a tourist's response, but something more like assessment. She was calculating what it would cost to live here and deciding if she could pay it. The north pasture fence needs restringing, he said, mostly because he felt the need to be honest about the state of things before she saw them. I noticed, she said, from the road. He glanced at her. You know, fence line. I know what broken looks like. He almost smiled. He did not quite allow it. The ranch came into view gradually, the way modest things do without announcing itself. The main house was stone and timber, square and low, built to endure rather than impress. The barn was in better shape than the house, which told a story about the man who owned it, or at least he hoped it did. The yard had not been tended lately. There was a rusted piece of equipment near the gate that he had been meaning to move for 6 weeks. He felt suddenly aware of all of it. She stepped down from the wagon before he could help her and stood looking at the house for a moment. It's solid, she said. It needs work. Most things worth keeping do. She turned and looked at him then, and something shifted very slightly in her expression, not warmth, not yet, but the thing that comes before warmth, which is the decision to remain open to it. He recognized it because he was making the same decision himself. They were married 8 days later before a judge in town, with his neighbor Holt Decker and Holt's wife Berta standing as witnesses. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Holt, who was 62 and had never once in his life kept a significant thought to himself, told Cal afterward that Ada was a handsome woman and that he ought not to let her get away, and then immediately corrected himself by saying that technically she was already legally prevented from doing so, which was the funniest thing he had said all year, and Holt laughed at his own observation for slightly too long while Berta looked at the ceiling. Ada had worn a dark blue dress and held the small wooden box on her lap during the wagon ride to town, resting her hands flat on top of it the way you rest your hands on something that contains something irreplaceable. He did not ask. She did not explain. The box sat on the shelf above the wash basin in the room she had taken as her own, and he noticed it every time he passed the open doorway, and he noticed that he noticed it, and he understood that the box was an open question he was not yet entitled to ask. The first weeks of the marriage were, in their way, a kind of careful architecture. Two people who were not strangers to solitude learning the geometry of existing in the same space without collision or false intimacy. He rose before light and was already in the barn when she came down to build the fire. She cooked without ceremony and expected the same in return. He was not a man given to small complaints, and she did not appear to be a woman who would have tolerated them. They ate together at the kitchen table with something approaching ease, sometimes talking about the work ahead, sometimes not talking at all, and the silence between them was a different quality than the silence of a house with only one person in it. It had weight and texture and the faint warmth of shared presence. She learned the ranch methodically, not as someone being shown around a new place, but as someone taking inventory of what was possible. She walked the pastures on the second day and the creek line on the third, and by the end of the first week she had cataloged in her head, he could tell by the way she spoke of things, every repair that needed doing and approximately what order they ought to be done in. When a calf was born early and came out sideways on a cold midnight, she was already dressed and in the barn before he had his boots on, and she knew what she was doing in a way that came only from having done it before, from having learned it young in a place that demanded competency as the price of belonging. He watched her more than he spoke to her, which was his nature with things he wanted to understand. She repaired the kitchen window herself using tools she found in the shed, not asking for help but not refusing it when he held the frame steady without being asked. She started a kitchen garden along the south wall in the shelter of the stone, turning the soil in November against the spring. She mended harness leather in the evenings by lamplight with small, precise stitches, and she read in the same lamplight when the mending was done real books, serious ones, which she had carried in the traveling case and arranged on the shelf without asking if there was space. There was space. He had made sure of it when she arrived, though he had not mentioned this. They had agreed in the plainest terms of their arrangement that the marriage would be a practical one and that neither party was obligated to anything beyond the requirements of running the ranch and satisfying the deed. He had said this clearly, and she had accepted it clearly, and he had meant it genuinely at the time. But something about the word arrangement had begun to feel insufficient in ways he could not entirely account for, not because of anything she said or any move she made toward him. Because of how she moved through the place he had built. Because of the way she spoke to the horses, not sweetly, not with the sentimentality people perform for animals, but honestly, as though they were capable of understanding a fair exchange. Because of the way she stood at the edge of the north pasture at dusk some evenings and looked at the distance with an expression he recognized now as something belonging to her alone, a kind of reckoning with something he could not see. The wooden box stayed on its shelf. He told himself he was not curious about it. This was not entirely true. Holt Decker came by in late November with a wagon load of winter squash he claimed he had too much of, which everyone understood to mean he had come to look at the new missus. Merit and form an opinion. Ada received him at the kitchen door and offered coffee and listened, while Holt talked about the winter ahead and the price of beef and the condition of the county road. And Holt, who had lived long enough to recognize when he was being managed, left 40 minutes later looking pleasantly unsettled. "He's a good man," Ada said after the wagon had gone. "He means well," Cal said. "Those are different things, but they can coexist." He thought about that for a while. December came hard and early. The first real snow arrived on the second night of the month, covering the yard in 8 inches of dry cold white, and Cal was up before dawn pulling hay and breaking ice on the water troughs. And when he came in at mid-morning, Ada had already been out to check the south pasture and had lost only 2 boots worth of snow to the well path, which she had cleared herself with the flathead shovel. She had also made a soup from the dried beans and smoked bone that had been sitting in the larder for weeks because neither of them had gotten to it. And it was very good, though neither of them said so in those specific words. He had a second bowl without comment. She poured it without comment. These were their versions of the same sentence. It was during the second hard freeze in January that he first saw the letter. He had come in from the barn late and she was sitting at the kitchen table writing, which she did sometimes. He assumed accounts or lists or the correspondence that practical people maintain against the drift of time. But the paper she was writing on was thinner than her usual stock, and she folded it quickly when he entered, not guiltily, not with the theatrical speed of someone trying to hide something, but with a small deliberate motion that was more private than secretive. He noticed the difference. He also noticed, because he was a man who noticed things he wished sometimes he did not, that the envelope on the table already had an address written on it in a different hand, not hers. Someone had pre-addressed it and sent it to her here. He said nothing. He hung his coat. He washed his hands. But he lay awake that night measuring the distance between what he knew and what he was beginning to suspect, and the distance was not comfortable. There were other small things that accumulated over January and into February. A certain thinning of her expression when the mail came, which she always retrieved herself and sorted privately before bringing in what was meant for the household. A pause before answering whenever he asked anything about where she had been between her father's death and her arrival here, which she filled competently enough, but which had the slight internal pressure of water behind a dam. A habit she had of checking the road from the front window in the late afternoon, not anxiously, but with a regularity that suggested she was watching for something specific. He told himself he had given his word not to press her. She had told him plainly in her first letter that she had her own reasons for needing a quiet place to begin again. He had accepted that without condition. Pressing her now would be a kind of breach. And yet, the wooden box. The pre-addressed envelope. The road. He understood without fully articulating it to himself that these things were connected. That they represented not a lie but an omission, which in most cases was a lesser thing, but which in the particular architecture of trust they had been quietly building across 4 months of shared labor and shared silence and shared soup, felt heavier than he had expected. He did not ask, he waited. February was its own kind of endurance, the month that tests whether you decided the land correctly, whether your stores are deep enough, whether the work you did in fall was the right work. The cattle came through well. The stone house held its warmth. The kitchen garden was under its frost cloth waiting. Ada had begun cataloging the barn tools in a ledger she had purchased in town, noting condition and repair cost beside each item in the same careful, even hand she had used in her first letter to him. And he found the ledger on the workbench one morning and stood there reading it for longer than was strictly necessary for the information it contained. It was the most useful thing anyone had ever done in that barn, and no one had asked her to do it. He set the ledger down and went back to work, and he thought, this is what it looks like when a person decides to stay somewhere. Not the declaration, the ledger. He thought too, I want her to stay. This was the first time he had thought it in exactly those words. It felt like turning something over in the hand that has been in the pocket a long time. In the third week of February, a man came to the ranch. He arrived on horseback in the mid-afternoon, which was notable because nobody came out that far in that weather on horseback without a specific purpose. He was well-dressed in the way that city men in county business tended to be well-dressed, which is to say more dressed than the weather called for, and he asked for Mrs. Merritt specifically, not the Merritt place, which told Cal something about the precision of the man's information. Ada came to the door herself. Cal watched from the far side of the yard without making a pretense of not watching. Something changed in her face when she saw the man. It was not fear and it was not warmth. It was the expression of someone who has known for a while that a particular conversation was coming and has spent that time deciding how to have it. She spoke to the man for 4 minutes outside the door. Cal could not hear the words over the wind. The man held his hat in his hands and did most of the speaking. Ada listened in the way she always listened, completely still, giving nothing away until she had finished receiving the information. Then she said something short, and the man nodded and replaced his hat and rode back down the road. She came back inside. She stood at the wash basin and looked at the wooden box on the shelf above it for a moment before turning to where Cal stood in the kitchen doorway. A silence. That was a solicitor, she said, from my family's situation. He waited, she said, I was married before. She did not say it dramatically. She said it the way you say something you have been carrying for a long time and have finally set down in a specific place. The marriage had ended legally, properly ended, 2 years before she had written to him, and she had ended it for reasons she named plainly. A man who had believed that owning a woman's time was the same as having her presence, and who had eventually demonstrated this belief in ways that had left marks she did not describe, but which her careful composure made entirely believable. The solicitor had come because there was a financial matter, a property question left unresolved from the dissolution, that required her signature and her acknowledgement of an address. She had not told Cal before the marriage because she had been afraid, not of him specifically, she said, but of the version of that information that travels ahead of a person in small places and closes doors before you reach them. She had been going to tell him. She had been measuring the right time. The wooden box, she said after a moment, contained her mother's letters, nothing more. She had carried them since her father's ranch was sold because there had been nowhere else to put them, and she had no intention of letting them go. He stood very still through all of this. Outside, the wind moved against the window in long, slow pressures. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet in a way that felt like it was waiting for its own verdict. "You're afraid I'll think less of you," he said. She met his eyes. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I don't." He said it plainly, without reaching for more than those two words, because he was not the kind of man who dressed things up. But she heard what was underneath them. He could tell by the small change in her face, not relief exactly, but the thing that comes after relief, which is the gradual, careful putting down of a weight that has been carried a long distance. He did not move toward her. She did not move toward him. They stood on their respective sides of the kitchen with the lamp between them and the wind outside and the ranch around them, and neither of them said anything further, and this particular silence was an entirely different quality from all the silences before it. It was more like ground. The weeks after that were different in a way that did not announce itself loudly but was present in everything. There was less distance in the ordinary movements of the day. When she brought him coffee in the barn, he did not set it on the post and walk away. He took it from her hand and they stood for a moment in the smell of hay and cold and horse, and she told him what she had noticed about the east pasture drainage, and he told her what he had been thinking about the spring calving numbers, and this was not, in the technical sense, a romantic conversation, but it was, in every sense that mattered, an intimate one. He started telling her things about the land he had not told anyone, not because he had hidden them, but because there had been no one to tell. About where his grandfather had built the first fence line and why it had been built in that particular place. About the creek that flooded every 7 years with a predictability that the old man had charted in a notebook Cal still had. About the years when the cattle prices had dropped and the ranch had run on will alone, and about what that had cost and what it had made possible. She listened without performing attention. She asked questions that showed she had been listening. He discovered over the course of March that he liked talking to her. This was not a small discovery for a man who had spent years pruning himself down to function. The deed was filed with the county the first week of March. The land was secured. The bank received its confirmation. Holtdecker brought over a bottle of something he had been saving since a previous occasion he had not specified, and they all sat at the kitchen table, and Holt said several things that were intended as toasts and succeeded as mild comedies, and Berta told Ada that she had done a fine thing with the kitchen garden layout, and that the south wall placement was something she herself had suggested to Holt for 20 years without result, and Holt said the orientation had been his idea originally. And everyone at the table let this stand for the sake of an otherwise pleasant evening. After they left, Ada and Cal sat a while longer at the table without clearing the cups. The lamp was low. Outside the night was still and clear, the kind of March night that reminds you the cold is not finished but is beginning to doubt itself. "The land is safe," she said. "Thanks to you." She shook her head slightly. "Thanks to a piece of paper. The paper required you." A pause. "Cal." It was the first time she had used his given name without any prefix and without any qualifier. It arrived in the room like something that had been standing outside for a long time. He looked at her. "I'm glad it was this place," she said. "I'm glad it was you." He was quiet for long enough that she might have wondered. Then he said, "I'd like to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." She waited. What would it take for this to be real? She looked at him for a moment with that characteristic directness that had startled him that first day at the stage stop and that he had come to understand was not challenge but honesty. The same quality in her that had built the barn ledger and turned the kitchen garden soil in November and written him a letter that told a truth before it told a name. "It's already real," she said. And then, because she was Ada Voss and not a woman given to ornamentation, she picked up her empty coffee cup and took it to the wash basin. And as she set it down, her hand rested for a moment against the wooden box on the shelf above it. And she did not pick the box up or open it, but simply rested her hand against it. And that gesture was not grief and not goodbye, but something more like continuity. The acknowledgement that a life is made of all its parts, and that a person worth knowing carries all of theirs honestly into the places they are willing to stay. Spring came the way it comes in high plains country, not all at once but in negotiations, a warm week, then a late freeze, then a morning that smells irrevocably of green and turned earth and the particular quality of light that has been absent since October. The kitchen garden came up along the south wall in early April. The first green there had been in that yard in longer than Cal could say, and he noticed it on a Tuesday morning while he was crossing from the barn, and he stopped and looked at it for a moment in a way he would not have stopped and looked at a garden under ordinary circumstances. He thought she put that there. He thought she's still here. He thought the land has always been worth keeping. It took her arrival to teach him what that actually meant, which was not acreage or inheritance or the terms of a deed written by an old man with a theory about dirt and family. It meant that the things worth preserving were not the things you inherited. They were the things you chose every morning when you got up and went out into the cold and did the work, and came back inside to the person who had also gotten up and done the work and come back inside. He found her in the kitchen measuring coffee and told her that the east fence posts she had identified in the barn ledger, the ones she had marked in need of replacement, were in worse shape than he had initially assessed, and they ought to get to them before the ground dried fully. She said she had already ordered the cedar posts from the mill in town and they would arrive Thursday. He looked at her. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it. This was not technically a declaration. It was a Tuesday morning in April in a stone kitchen in the High Plains, with a garden along the south wall that had not been there the previous year and a barn ledger that had made the coming season more manageable than the last, and two people standing in the ordinary geography of a life. They were building together out of plain-spoken honesty and shared labor and the particular kind of trust that does not announce itself, because it does not need to. Outside, the wind moved across the grass in long, slow waves, and the land held steady under it, as it always had, as it would, patient and wide and entirely indifferent to anything that was not true. The wooden box stayed on its shelf. The garden grew along the south wall. And on a morning later that spring, when the creek was running clear and the cattle were moving well across the greening north pasture, and the fence line along the east boundary stood straight and new in the early light, Cal Merritt stood at the pasture gate with his coffee and felt, for the first time in longer than he could account for, that the place around him was not simply his inheritance but his home, which was a different thing entirely and which required, it turned out, not just a deed and a signature and an arrangement, but someone who understood broken things, who read them correctly, who ordered the cedar posts before you thought to ask, who kept her mother's letters in a wooden box and told the truth in 3 paragraphs before she told you her name. He thought about what he would say to her when he went back in. He decided he would say, "The fence looks right." And she would say, "I know." And they would both understand that they were not talking about the fence at all.